Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. My name is Owen Fitzpatrick, and today we're going to be talking with a very dear friend of mine and also an extremely accomplished expert, differentiation expert. That I've been lucky enough to work with. So, Mark Levy is a differentiation expert. He differentiates companies, brands, and thought leaders. He helps them to come up with what he calls their big, sexy idea. It's their signature idea, the idea that they're going to be known for throughout the world. The ideas Mark and his clients have created have been talked about and written about by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. He's the founder of Levy Innovation LLC, a positioning and branding firm that helps consultants and other thought leaders increase their fees by up to 2,000%. In addition to being a positioning consultant, Mark creates magic tricks and shows. His work is being performed in Carnegie Hall in Las Vegas and all the major TV networks. He co-created the off-Broadway show Chamber Magic, which is played for 16 years, is the longest running one-person show in New York City, and also got the highest ratings, I believe, in terms of TripAdvisor, Mark, if I'm not mistaken.
It's rated, actually, it's been playing 22 years right now.
Oh,
So that
wow.
might be old. I apologize. There's something old online. Um, uh, and it's the highest rated live show in New York City on TripAdvisor, rated higher than even Hamilton.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that says everything. And just last but not least, Mark has worked with the likes of Marshall Goldsmith and Simon Sinek. In fact, Simon Sinek says that Mark helped him find his why. So you're very welcome, Mark. Thank you so much for taking time to come out and to talk to me today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
So just to start off with, Mark, I mean, obviously you're known as a differentiation expert. I first met you in the National Speakers Association. You did a speech to our chapter, and I got a chance to talk to you at dinner the night before. And
Right.
immediately I was taken with number one, how well you listen, but number two, how effectively you're able to really hit the nail on the head. You were able to very quickly understand exactly what people were saying to you and what made them different, what made them unique. And you gave even examples, in the following day when you were presenting. So all of the work that you do is about differentiation. Could I start with a simple question? Why is differentiation so important for thought leaders out there?
Okay. Well, thank you for those kind words. So I want to answer your simple question, but then I want to tell a story because it pertains exactly to what you just said. So there are there are 8 billion personal brands out there in the world today, right? There's 8 billion people, and we all supposedly have our personal brand. So in order to get your ideas out in the world and to get your excellence out into the world, you need to stand out. You can't just present people a mass of ideas and expect them to make meaning of your own life. And by the way, I'm talking about individuals. This is also true for companies, that if you show people your entire menu board, they won't even stop to look to see what kind of food it is. That you need to come up with a specific idea, like a foot in the door, something that's emblematic of who you are and what you want to do in the world, and you lead with that. And now that becomes an umbrella thought about who you are, an overarching thought. And now people can make sense of what you bring in behind that, right? And so they'll seek you out, they'll want to work with you because of that. And so that's the idea about differentiation. The story that I wanted to tell real quick, because you kindly said I listen really well and I'm really good at coming up with the main idea about what's just been said and talking about it. So years ago, and for 14 years, I was a director of sales of the third largest book wholesaler in the world. We'd buy millions of dollars worth of books from Random House, Simon and Schuster, Doubleday, and other major publishers. And then we'd sell them to independent bookshops, Barnes and Nobles, and so forth. And did that for 14 years. So for 14 years, this is what my life was. Every single day, I would get every single new book that came out in the marketplace from every publisher. And I would look at them and I'd have to decide, is this book worth selling? what is this book about? What does the publisher say it's about? What does the author say it's about? What's the color in it? Like, what are the stories or so? And I'd have to do this within like a minute for each book. I don't mean that this was a big thing. And should this book be selling? Like, I don't care what the publisher says and what the author says. Do I think my clients need this book? Has the world changed since they first decided to publish this book a year and a half earlier? And now the book's finally being released. Like, what's this book about? Should it be selling? And how would I sell it fast on the phone to my clients? And over the course of 14 years, I helped my company sell over $1 billion worth of books, which is hard because books back then, at least, were very, very cheap. But also, I did a calculation on this, and this figure's low, what I'm about to say. I construed over those 14 years, I must have done 25,000 pitches to live customers, like to try to make money right then and there, right? And so one of the reasons, by the way, when I left that business after 14 years, all I did, because I had achieved the highest levels I could. I was 3 times nominated Publishers Weekly Sales Rep of the Year, blah, 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 $1 billion, all these things. And so all I did was I took the same talent and I applied it to businesses and to human beings. Like, it didn't matter if you were $1 billion company or an individual. If you hired me, I would look at your business as if it were a book, right? Whether you had written a book or not made no difference. I would look at your life as if it were a book. And I would say, what book have you written with your life so far and your business? What's the main idea? What are the ancillary ideas? What are the stories behind it? What are the lessons of those stories? If we took a smaller satellite idea and moved it to the fore and made the book about that satellite idea, or we took 2 ideas that you hadn't put together before and put them together and moved that to the fore, or took a lesson from a story that you hadn't been using and put that to the fore, would your book be a better selling book? And how would you go about pitching it? How would you go about selling it? So all I did was I took this talent that I had honed over 14 years and 25,000 pitches, and I just applied it to people's work. So anyway, forgive the long-winded story, but that's why it's not that I'm so talented. It's that I have more practice in sizing something up quickly and pitching it for money than probably anyone who you've ever met.
Sure. Well, look, that does at least partly explain a lot of the things that I saw, and again, having the opportunity to work with you for a number of months, and we were on weekly calls, and I went out and visited you, and we spent some time on it. But a large part of when you first were describing differentiation, you talked about how to have this initial thing that immediately paves the way. And that's, for me, what I was struggling with, and what I'm sure a lot of people struggle with, is there's so many different things. And I know myself, I have a very diverse array of sets of expertise, all in the field of psychology. But when it comes to actually all the things that I train on or speak on, it's huge. It's a huge diversity of different topics. So one of the things that you explained to me very early on is that you don't have to give up everything, but you do have to have something that you act as, and you described it, which I loved, as an icebreaker, right? So this is the ship that goes along and breaks things down, and then there's another ship that comes after it, right? So it paves the way for everything else that you do. A way that you describe something like that is your trademark, something that you talk about all the time, the big sexy idea. Could you share with us what the big sexy idea is and why it matters so much?
Sure. So the icebreaker analogy that I created, just to be a little more specific with it. So I like to say, because this really explains big sexy idea and differentiation are so beautifully. It's the fact of icebreaker ships that go to the Antarctic, the South Pole, the North Pole. They are made in a different way than the other ships. They have a different type of hull. It's made of a different type of material. They have teeth on them, and they're made to shunt the ice off as they're sailing, as they're moving through the ice flow. They're breaking up the ice with the front of the ship, and the hull shunts it off to the sides. Now, the thing about the icebreaker ship is the icebreaker ship is not the reason why the ship is cutting a channel into the ice. In other words, it's not cutting it for itself. It's making a path so that all the important ships with all the doctors on board and the medicine on board and the medical equipment on board and the passengers on board, those can get through the ice to get where they need to go to use the medicine or so. So the icebreaker ship is like those others. It's a ship, but it's a very different kind of pointy, toothy ship that's sole purpose is to break through the ice so the important stuff can get through. So I say that your point of differentiation of your business or your product or your service is like the icebreaker ship. It's like the rest of your company, but it's not the entire company. It's just there to break through the icy indifference of the marketplace to you. That if you brought all the cool stuff that you were about, if that came in first, it would all break up or get caught in the ice flow and none of it would get through. So you need this thing that is designated to do one thing, and that's to break through people's attention. And that's what your point of differentiation is. It's there at the forefront of your website, of your elevator speeches, of your product copy, your service copy, or whatnot, so that people say, wow, I want to know about this. And it's because, and you can talk about this much better than I can, it's the fact that that people make snap judgments based on almost no information and no deliberation. They very quickly say, this is cool, I want to learn more about this, or there's not much to see here, I'm going to move on and ignore this. So when you lead with a big, sexy idea with a point of differentiation about what it is you do, it doesn't mean everyone's going to want to deal with you, but the right people, you will stop them in their tracks so that they will want to learn more about you, right? So it's a foot in the door.
Great. And so with this foot in the door, you have a great definition of the big sexy idea. Could you share that with us and then also give us a little bit more, background as to what it
Sure.
looks like or some examples?
Oh, absolutely. So I have many definitions of big, sexy ideas. What's the one that you're referring to?
It's
And
the
I'll
one
speak to
such that if the big sexy idea is one such that if you say it, you can only be known. I'm butchering it right now as we
that.
speak, but it's you can only you will be known for that idea in the marketplace. That kind of one.
Oh yeah, it's the idea that you're so associated with the big sexy idea of your business that if someone in the marketplace wanted that idea in their life as part of their life, they would have to go to you to get that idea. If they went to someone else to get that idea, they'd be getting a diet version of the idea. They'd be getting a flat, bland, lousy version of the idea. So for full potency, they have to go to you. And a big, sexy idea to me is an idea that is so compelling, it almost has its own charisma. That the idea can be talked about and spoken about by people without you even being there, that it becomes a topic of conversation in your industry or even on the world stage, where conversations start to turn like in order to discuss your idea and what it is, right? That's go
Yeah,
ahead.
100%. And so to take an example of this with one of
Yeah.
your past clients, Simon Sinek, the first big sexy idea, at least he had, because since then you could argue that there's another one with the Infinity Game and
Oh
with some
yeah.
of these other work. But the big sexy idea that Simon came up with was pretty much start with why, right? People don't
Right.
buy people don't care what you do, they care why you do it, something along those
Right.
lines. So they don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And he kind of proposed that initially, at least in the video that went viral, which is the TED talk or TEDx talk of what great leaders do to inspire action. What makes that a big sexy idea in your opinion, Mark? And what other examples are there of other thought leaders?
Yeah, well, that idea was entirely, it was so much about meaning, but it was about meaning for the individual. It was happening to them. As you had said at the beginning, I have a background as a magician, right? And we magicians know that the tricks that people remember are the tricks that they're able to say, this happened to me, right? There's a magician who all magicians know. He's a wonderful magician. His name's Michael Amar. He won Magician of the Year from the Magic Castle like 6 times. And when Michael, years ago, Michael, when he was in college, I think he was working in nursing homes. And like he was just volunteering in nursing homes. And just as part of the work he was doing, he would ask the people he was working with, he would say, uh, have you ever seen a magician live? And if any of them had seen a magician live, he'd say, what tricks do you remember doing? What tricks do you remember seeing from this magician who you saw live? And overwhelmingly, these people, right, who had seen magicians decades earlier, they didn't remember about floating a lady. They didn't remember about sawing a person in half. They didn't remember like producing colorful silks from a hat or anything like that. They invariably remembered tricks that happened in their own hands. So the things they'd remember was, oh, the magician borrowed a quarter from me and he bent the quarter with his mind without even touching it. I was holding it in my hand or whatnot, right? So it was always things where they could say, like, I had a hand in that trick. I did something. So invariably, when you try to come up with a big, sexy idea, often to your audience, it's something where it affects their life directly, where it's not some abstraction out there in the world. I'll tell you, you wanted to know another story about this, so we're talking about meaning. So one of my clients, who I adore, Lisa McLeod. So Lisa years ago came to me, and she was a sales trainer at one point for Procter and Gamble. And so, in order to differentiate her, um, we were talking about her life. So invariably, I go to people, even in large organizations, giant $1 billion, it's always about their lives. So I'm talking to her about her life. And one thing she talks about was she started to talk about Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Like we had these long, you know this, Owen, you're a client, like we had these long talks about life in general. And she was talking about how they hated one another, but they were able to put aside their differences in order to write the Declaration of Independence, like something more important than their differences. She was talking about that. And we started to talk about different sales philosophies and whatnot. And just apropos of nothing, in the middle, like just in a sentence, this was not even what the sentence was about. I remember she stopped. She said, what I really want to do is I'm trying to remember the phrase she said. She said, I want to restore the nobility to the sales profession. And then she went on talking about whatever it was she was talking. So anyway, after a couple of days of talking to her, I said, okay, so here's what your thing is, right? You're not going to teach people on other people's sales methodology the way you had been. You're not going to do it anymore. Like you're too good for that. Like you're going to teach them your own sales methodology. And that's called selling with noble purpose, right? She had said, I want to restore nobility. And here's what selling with noble purpose is about. And she had told me that she had been part of a study. She was an expert brought in to trail 40 people from a biotech firm who the organization, the biotech company, they wanted to know. They said, here's 40 salespeople of ours. A few of them are top performers and the rest are not. We're not going to tell you who's who. We want you to go with them out in the field as they do sales calls separately on their own. And we want you to watch them and interview them. And we want you to tell us who you think the best salespeople are, because maybe we're not seeing something that you'll see. So we want you to see, like a detective, if you can find out, and then we'll tell you if you're right or wrong. And so Lisa went out and did that, and she wasn't really gaining any traction. She was interviewing people, but one day she was waiting at an airport in Phoenix, and a salesperson she was in the salesperson's car, and it was a Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock. And Lisa said, "I guess you're going to go home now. It's Friday afternoon at 5." And the woman said, the sales rep said, "No, I'm going to make another call or two on doctors' offices." And Lisa said, "Why are you doing that? It's quitting time." And she said, "For this reason." And so the sales rep said that a few years earlier, she had gone to a doctor's office, and an older woman was there and came up to her and said, "I see from your name badge, you're from this biotech firm. Is that right?" And the sales rep said, "Yeah." And the woman said, "Thank you for giving me my life back. That I had rheumatoid arthritis, that I couldn't grip the steering wheel of my car, so I couldn't drive. I couldn't get down on the floor to play with my grandkids because of my knees. My life was miserable. I became a hermit, which is not who I am. But then my doctor gave me your drug, and now look at me. Afterwards, I'm going to go out with my girlfriends, and we're going to have a great time. We're going to go out tonight for dinner. So thank you, thank you, thank you." And as the sales rep was telling Lisa this story, she was in tears. And Lisa was in tears too, listening to it. And so the sales rep said, "That's why I'm going to call on another doctor's office or two now, because I know that there are a lot of people out there who need this drug, and I'm afraid that I'll miss some of them. So I want to make sure everyone gets it because I see the difference it makes." And so Lisa realized, after having this conversation, she realized that to this woman, she had never talked about sales quotas. She had only talked about changing people's lives. So Lisa went back to all the interview transcripts she had done with all the salesperson people, and she looked for the people who seemed to put purpose over sales quotas. And so she identified, and I'm making up these numbers, I don't remember exactly the amount, but she identified 8 out of the 40. And so she went to the biotech company and she said, "Here are these 8 people. I think that they're the best out of those 40. And here's the reason why, because they put purpose over sales quotas." And it ended up that Lisa was 100% accurate, based on her hypothesis, that those were the 8 best out of the 40. And the woman who she was crying with in the car was actually the top person of all 40. So from that became Selling with Noble Purpose, which became a bestseller, that became Leading with Noble Purpose. There were conferences that asked Lisa to use noble purpose, as the overarching theme of the conference or so. Anyway, I'm going on and on about this, but often the work in coming up with the big, sexy idea, it's never something subtle. Mm-hmm. It's always something overwhelmingly like a freak out. It's always something big, big, big. It's often something that's there in what you're doing, but you don't, you almost say it as a side comment. You're almost sometimes embarrassed to talk about it, because it just seems like an idiosyncratic part of what's happening. It often doesn't seem major. There's lots of things about it, but it's the thing that freaks people out about what it is you're doing.
I love that. I love that way of describing it. You've described like that before for me in terms of it's what freaks people out, in a very positive way, in a very good way. Right. Couple more questions, then we'll get to the quick fire round. But the one thing I wanted to ask you about is you did an exercise. I think it was at the NSA meeting, but it was to do with looking for looking for people who have released books that you wanted to have released. Could you talk
the
around
envy
that
exercise?
Idea? The what?
The envy exercise.
Yes, because that was the first time I ever did that, and it was, even not just for myself, but everybody else powerful. Could you talk us through just a little bit around how that works and what the psychology is behind it?
Yeah. So again, this idea of often the thing that is going to make your business famous is you already have the idea, but you haven't thought to use the idea to the degree to blow it up in a big way. And so you often you often can't reach that idea in a linear logical way, that you have to go radically right or left, or like go off the path in order to find your idea. So one way to take note of those kinds of things are that we're constantly giving ourselves information all day long about what's interesting, but we just don't notice it. That often are, if we pay attention to our intense emotional reactions during the day, things that make you deliriously happy, that make you excited, things that anger you, things that frustrate you, things that bore you. It's almost like you're workshopping good ideas. If you just pay attention to these sensations and why you're having them and how you might be able to use them, you're going to get amazing stuff. So one exercise that I had created 15 or 20 years ago was based on this. It's when I first thought of that idea of paying better attention to what you're doing day to day and the extreme reactions in order to find big, sexy ideas. So I called it the envy exercise. So what it was with you at least, I was speaking to a room full of speakers, and I said, you have no doubt in your speaking careers, you have seen another speaker or read a book from the bestseller list, a business book or so, where you said, wait a minute, that's my idea. That's my idea. Now, I know that person who's saying the speech or wrote the book, that they didn't plagiarize it from me. They don't know my work the same way I don't know their work. But the idea that they're featuring is emblematic of the work. It's super important to the work I do. So that should be my speech that I'm being paid enormous amounts of money for. That should be my best-selling book. Those should be my high-priced consulting clients. That should be me up there. I can't stand it. And I talk about how I came up with this idea was, again, 15, 20 years ago, I lived in New Jersey. And in Flemington, New Jersey, I walked into a strip mall and there was a Barnes and Noble there, and a new book had just come out. It was faced out in the business section. It was called Made to Stick. It had just come out that week. I had never seen it before. And I pulled it off the shelf and started to look at it.
That's the Heath brothers, right?
The Heath brothers wrote it. And I became so angry because there were thoughts in it, the ideas that I had thought of as proprietarily mine. Remember, this was 15 or 20 years ago. When I talked about differentiation, I talked a lot about surprise and so forth. And I saw a couple, two or three of these ideas in the table of contents. And I was actually started sweating. I became so angry while I was reading it. Now, the Heath brothers, they didn't know my work. They weren't taking anything from me, the same way I didn't know their work. We came upon this stuff like coincidentally. But I still remember reading their stuff and feeling like my claim had been jumped. And even though it was unintentional, like it was an accidental thing, I bought their book. I went home and I was so angry that I opened my basement door, and my basement was like the final scene of the first Indiana Jones film. There were boxes everywhere, and I just hurled the book. I didn't place it. I like you're skipping rocks. I just like threw the book in the basement. And to this day, I have never, ever read it, but I do remember the feeling. So I said to myself, why do I feel such envy? And so I then do an exercise with people. I say, now it's your turn to feel the anger that I felt 20 years ago in New Jersey. I want you to think of a moment when you felt envious, da, da, da. And so I have them do that part of the exercise. And then when they're finished with that part of the exercise, the second part of the exercise, I don't want to leave them in this angry, envious state. So I say, the person who wrote and spoke about that idea that you found envious, they didn't say everything that needed to be said about that idea. There are stories about that idea. There are insights about that idea. There are exercises and so forth about that idea that make that idea far more potent. Who knows those ideas, insights, stories, and exercises? You do. You, through all your work, you know such important stuff about that idea that no one else knows. And then I have them turn to their partner and talk about one thing from the envious idea that they know that other people don't know. And so that's my exercise. It's what do you know that they don't know? Or what
I
do
love
you know
it.
that right? And so from that, I've had people come up with their big, sexy idea just in my talks or in the workshops, just doing that exercise.
No, no, I remember, and you know, I think it's also alchemizing, you know, the envy, alchemizing that feeling of frustration that we can often have because again, you look out in the world and someone else comes up with something similar, and you're like, oh, immediately. And there's a you know there's a big difference between when someone's actually taking your work and stealing it versus when they you know
Oh, right.
come up, you know. But no, I found that really really helpful. So let's get straight into the quick fire round, if that's okay,
Sure.
Mark. Um,
Sure.
this just quick questions for you. We'll start off with your favorite movie or a favorite movie.
Uh, a favorite movie is There Will Be Blood with Daniel
That's
Day-Lewis.
right. I
I
know that film.
adore that. The Anderson film, Paul Michael Anderson. I think I adore that film.
Fantastic. Favorite author.
Uh, well, the first author that comes to mind, I'm not sure people would know him anymore because he died in 1989, but there was a short story writer who was very influential in my life growing up. His work was Donald Barthelme. He wrote these really odd stories about a guy whose best friend was the Phantom of the Opera, or Paul Klee, the 1920s artist, like being a soldier in World War One and having to guard an airplane that was strapped to a train and they were transporting it. Anyway, he would do these really unusual stories, or everyone in Manhattan waking up one morning and all of Manhattan is covered by a giant balloon and how people interacted with the balloon, or a man who climbed up a skyscraper of 100 stories and the short story is told in 100 sentences and they're numbered, sentence number one, sentence number two. So it was that idea of playfulness, of high concept, of you didn't know what the next sentence was going to bring, so
Yeah,
you had to be focused on it. You couldn't fall asleep. That was just so influential in my life, of do stuff that's super cool that people have to pay attention to.
love it, love it. Favorite book.
My favorite book, he just died recently. There was a wonderful Charles Portis, who's well known for writing the book True Grit, which sold 2 or 3 million copies, but a very unusual book he wrote. He wrote amazing humor novels. He wrote a book called Masters of Atlantis, which takes place in the 1940s predominantly, about the accidental founding of a benign cult of people who believe they're descended from the lost civilization of Atlantis. So it's a very funny book about people who think they're really important, but the rest of society looks at them as benign idiots.
Love it. I can think of a few. Favorite artist.
My favorite artist, well, if I take the word artist to include musicians, it would have to be the Beatles. Like I
That,
can, yeah.
that was the next one. So, have you any favorite artist in terms of artwork?
Uh, um, as far as artwork, I love art. I love
Yeah,
fine art. I'm just trying to think of a favorite. I can think of many artists as I'm
yeah,
speaking to you,
but not
but
one
I
that.
don't. Well, I will say a quote from Paul Cézanne, who I love. Cézanne, in one of his still lifes, it was a very unusual still life, and he had painted apples, and he said, I think this was his quote, it was certainly about his painting. He just said, with this apple, I will astonish Paris.
Love it.
So the idea that you could astonish Paris with an apple has always stayed with me.
I love
So
that.
even meager things, even
Yeah,
though he was talking about his representation of an apple,
yeah.
the idea that you could astonish a city with an apple,
I
love
love
it.
that. I love that. I'm gonna use that in the future. I think I love
Right,
that. Um,
right.
favorite philosopher.
My favorite philosopher. I've read a lot of philosophy, but I'm trying to. I mean, I don't know if you would call him a philosopher. He's more of a psychiatrist, but Viktor Frankl. right? Man's search for meaning,
Yeah,
and the idea that meaning is usually not handed to you. Meaning is something that you have to create and that you have to constantly refresh and devote yourself to new forms of meaning. Like if you stop, the meaning stops. You have to
yeah,
keep going in
yeah.
order to manufacture it. So that to me is a very important idea in life. By the way, related to that, this last week I bought this at a store. Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women, the 19th century novelist. It's a quote that says, "I like adventures, and I'm going to find some." And so to me, the idea of I like adventures because I love adventures. I'm an urban explorer. I go into abandoned buildings. I do all
Yeah,
kinds of things. But the idea of I like adventures and I'm going to find some. In
yeah,
other words, I'm going out to
yeah,
seek
yeah.
adventure. I'm not going to wait for adventure to come to me.
Yeah, it's like there is a part two to everything. You know, there's the idea and then there's the execution. Um,
Right.
love it. Favorite TV series?
Oh, I can answer that without even the Odd Couple, the
Yeah,
one with Tony Randall and Jack Klugman, the Gary Marshall series in the 70s. I used to watch that so often that the rhythms and the jokes just became, I internalized them. So I would have to say that one of the reasons I'm able to differentiate and help and come up with big, sexy ideas that hundreds of millions of people know is because I watched The Odd Couple.
well, there you go. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are going to start looking back at them um, as the secret. A superpower. If you could have any superpower, which one would you have?
Oh, wow. Um, um, if I could have any, I think it would be um, phenomenal strength. I just find the ability to move things around physically to be so compelling. I've always loved watching power lifters and whatnot.
Yeah,
And just the idea of being that strong like helps you in
yeah.
in
So
in
many ways.
in so many ways. Yes, I'll stop there. I could talk for a half an hour about this, but I want to.
There's just a couple more. So just three or four more.
Yeah.
So ideal time travel. Where would you go if you could travel through time in the past or the future?
Oh, yeah. I think the answer I should be giving is the future,
Okay.
but it's so terrifying to me to think about differences in the future. If I could go, if I could go anywhere in the past, uh, I'm guessing that I would want to go back and speak to a great author like Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, although I'd have to learn Russian now that I think about that.
There you
So
go.
I need to learn Russian first, and then I'd go back and speak to Tolstoy. I think that's it.
Okay. If you were to live anywhere else besides where you're living, where would you live?
Oh, uh, that's a tough question for me because I love everywhere. Like everywhere I go, I just acclimate to it. I just say, "Oh, this is the greatest place in the world,"
Right.
wherever it is I go.
It,
Uh, but I've never lived in a really warm place. I've only lived on the East Coast of the United States. I've lived in New York, New Jersey, and now Pennsylvania. So it would probably have to be like a warm, it would have to be like California or something, just for the difference.
if you were to do any other career besides what you're doing, what would you do?
I'd be a magician. I, I
Oh,
I I know that I create magic tricks and shows and so forth, and I can do magic. If you hung out with me, I'd be doing magic for you. But I've never made my living from being a magician, so I'd be a magician.
and last but not least, one piece of advice for the world, Mark. If you were to summarize it in a sentence or so on a billboard, what would be the advice?
Oh, see, you didn't prepare me for this, everyone who's listening. It's not like that Owen and I are friends, and I mean we are friends, but that he said, "Oh, and I'm going to ask you
No
a
pressure.
of advice." No, no, but I'm going to go to probably the most important piece of advice, marketing advice, but it actually extends out into life. Or so I tell people that the most important piece of advice in marketing and positioning is to be honest about your offerings, about your philosophy, about why you do the work you do. But I mean honest to a degree that most people haven't been yet. By honest, I almost mean like the way a writer is honest in accuracy. Like when describing something, it's not a car, it's a 2014 Jeep Wrangler, red Jeep Wrangler. Like that's to me a kind of different degree of honesty. So it's in our interactions and in our work or so, it's to be ridiculously honest and accurate in what it is that you're talking about.
Love
If
it.
that makes sense. Yeah.
That's great. Listen, where can people find out more about you?
Oh, and by the way, just to add on to something like that, only because I spoke about this to the client I was on right before this call, it's the idea of people get in trouble, I find, when they want their work or their product or their service or something to be more important than it is. That, in other words, you can be doing something important and you don't have to be way over the top hyperbolic about it. It's okay to sometimes be. I'm sometimes way over the top hyperbolic about things. But in general, if you just say what is, that's more effective than trying to coerce people to
Sure.
think in a much bigger way. So
Sure.
anyway, forgive me for blathering about it. How can people find out more? My website and my contact information's on the website. It's levyinnovation.com. That's Levy and then the word innovation with no S at the end.com. Levyinnovation.com.
Fantastic. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. Thank you so much for all the great help you've given me over the last year or so since we've known each other. It's been about a year now since we met, believe it or not. So really
Well,
appreciate it. It's been a pleasure for me and still is. And it's great to count you as, as a mentor and as a friend. So thank you so much for everything.
thank you so much, Owen. It's a real pleasure.